and welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning. For those who think that words are more injurious than sticks and stones, I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving.
No, you can't.
In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection.
Mhm.
This week, Lydia McGrew joins us to tackle the topic of Greco-Roman biography and the Gospels. Many will not know what we're talking about, and I didn't until like three
We
minutes
hope
ago.
they do after we're done.
Yeah, yeah. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is still Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience, but it should be yours. The Bible Buffet. Our regular legal disclaimer. Our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Dr. Lydia McGrew, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter referred to as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content.
Right, we just don't care.
I'm having a senior moment, Don. I forget whether I turned on the sound for this. So can you tell me if I didn't when it comes on? Yeah, you'll tell me. You'll just interrupt me. Okay. Notice the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And as you do, never fear. This webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now our special guest, Dr. Lydia McGrew. That studio audience, you just can't beat them, So, yes. So, apparently I remembered what I was supposed to do.
Well, it's really hard telling, but we're glad that you have joined us. You may not be when we're done.
yeah. We'll see how this ends.
And we invited her because she's one who can actually lay down on the job and still perform it, which we're really glad about that.
Yeah.
So
thank you guys for having me. We had a fun time before this all started, so we're cool going into this. I'm good with these guys.
Okay. So she's vouching for us, which nobody else will do. So,
yeah, exactly. we should like carve that out and keep it as a promotion for the show.
Yeah, we're gonna.
Yeah, we're gonna do that. I want to say something up front. This is a very important topic, and Lydia McGrew is. I'm going to read this. A widely published analytic philosopher and author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She has published extensively in the theory of knowledge. I didn't know there was a theory of knowledge per se, but
yeah, it's all theoretical. We don't know.
It's all theoretical. Knowledge is just theoretical, exactly.
It's just a theory.
Specializing in formal epistemology and application to the evaluation of testimony and the philosophy of religion, she defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in 4 books. Most recently, Testimonies to the Truth: Why You Can Trust the Gospels, and that is part of what got our attention. Also, 2 very good friends that work with the ministry. Marcia Montenegro handles all of our New Age stuff, and Dr. Bill Roach, who's on our advisory board, both said you need to get her on here, even though she is a, how did you phrase that, Ron?
An inerrancy-friendly non-inerrantist. I believe that's a direct quote.
Yeah, friendly non-inerrantists.
So you have the inerrancy hostile non-inerrantists, but she's not one of them.
No, and she's not one of them. She's a friendly one, which we like friendly better than non-friendly. So
yes.
But I'm also not a fake inerrantist.
Yeah, exactly.
Better to be an open non-inerrantist than to be a fake inerrantist.
Like somebody whose name might be coming up today.
Might possibly, yes.
We're going to name names, so.
Well, why don't we just get that one out of the way? We are going to be mentioning Michael Licona along the way. So,
It's
Stay
not
tuned.
about. It's not just about doctrine. It's about the names we name along the way. So
Exactly.
the friends we
It
meet.
can be. So, but and someone would say, why would you do that? Well, because the topic is so important that sometimes we've had Wiccans on in the past, because what they're talking about is important for us to understand what they believe. In this case, Lydia is doing a phenomenal job of doing something that others are not doing as well, which is a defense of the Gospels in the book of Acts. Are they reliable? Ron, what say you?
I say that I have a few slides that when you guys selected the title, I don't know if this was a cooperative effort or what, but somehow, you know, I saw the title and I thought, well, I'm going to find out what Lydia has said about these things. So I went and got some books that she wrote. I think the four that you mentioned, which I recommend. They're on Kindle, and I started perusing them, and they are wonderful. And I hope to keep reading them. I will. Um, and what I did was I tracked down the title um, of the today's session that we're doing. It's comes from part two, chapter 5 of her book, The Mirror and the Mask. What's the subtitle to that? It's too tiny for me to read.
Uh, defending the Gospels from.
Oh,
Gee, do I
something
have the
about
exact subtitle? Defending the Gospels from literary devices.
from literary devices, right? We know Satan's devices, and many of them are literary. So, but anyways, as I went through that chapter, it was very, very helpful. Um, the it's the chapter title is the Gospels Greco-Roman Biographies, and that is the title of our session to our episode. And you note in there that Plutarch wrote a series of biographies. I looked this up. They're called bioi in Greek, lives, or bios would be a life. Think of the life of Brian. Okay, don't think of that one. But in any case, you know, the lives of the Caesars, I think, was something somebody else wrote. But those the typical, maybe I think I'm thinking of the 12 Caesars. But in any case, life of Alexander, life of Julius Caesar. That was a parallel life edition that he came out with, where he's comparing these two lives, and then the life of Theseus and the life of Romulus. These were in his parallel lives series that he wrote. So I looked that up because you use the Greek word bioi in the original Greek alphabet as your subheadings in your chapters. So I want to look at what those subheadings are right now. The gospel, when you peruse the chapter, you encounter these subheadings, and maybe we could use these as springboards, or we could do something else. It doesn't matter to me. But you write the Gospels as bioi, limiting both unreliability and reliability. That was your first subheading. So that doesn't tell you a whole lot. You have to actually read it, but we can talk about it. The other one was two questions about the Gospels as Greco-Roman bioi. You can tell us what those are if you want. And the third subheading was, are the Gospels bio in an informative sense? So, do you want to start with those, or maybe we should start with who Michael Licona is and why and how?
No, I think let's move to that. Let's start with what these are, because the first question that we had up here is for an example of truthful and fictionalized literary device. Second question is, are the Gospels Greco-Roman biography? And if so, what difference does that make? And this kind of
Oh,
impacts that second question.
you're looking at the questions that we exchanged via email. I forgot
Yeah,
to put those on a slide. So,
that's okay.
what's that first question again?
First question is, can you give us an example of a truthful and fictionalized literary device?
Sure. So, a truthful literary device would be something like a figure of speech. So if I say I have a frog in my throat, Americans know immediately that that just means that my voice sounds kind of hoarse. It doesn't literally mean that I have a frog in my throat. Or if I say everybody and his brother knows who Elon Musk is. That doesn't mean that I'm literally saying that every person currently living on Earth knows who Elon Musk is. So that's hyperbole, right? So these are just immediately recognizable figures of speech where a competent, knowledgeable speaker or hearer of a given language is immediately going to know what that means. They're going to recognize it right away, and they're going to know what its semantic meaning is. A fictionalizing literary device would be something like in a partially fictional movie. So, to give an example, The King's Speech. I like that movie. As a movie, it's fun.
Great
Um,
film. Yeah.
it's a great film. It does have swearing in case that bothers you. But anyway, it's about George the Sixth, as he would be called when he became king, and he had this terrible speech impediment. And the movie changes some of the timing of that. And you can't tell by watching the movie. You can only find that out, if you go look it up somewhere else, that he didn't still have this great big problem after he became king. He had actually fixed it somewhat earlier. So they changed the time. That's a fictionalizing literary device. So there we've got an example of each of those. And notice that the truthful so-called device is something that you recognize immediately and you know what it actually means. The fictionalizing literary device, because it's woven into a work of art, you don't immediately recognize it. You know that it could be something like that could be done, but to find out exactly where it is done, you have to research independently. So that kind of gives you an idea of what these are.
Right.
So
And
there
that
are some literary devices that don't affect the truthfulness of the statement. And there are some that, well, if you're using this, if you call it, and the other thing about these literary devices is, can you even tell? I mean, these allegations that the gospel writers are using these devices, would a reader in the first century or any century just be able to automatically tell that, oh, this is,
Definitely. No, I mean, just like when we watch The King's Speech, we may know that it's merely based on true events, but we can't tell where it's been changed.
mhm,
Okay. And so the claim is, and I disagree with this claim, of course, that the Gospels were like that movie, The King's Speech, where
mhm.
people didn't get upset about it, but that didn't mean that they could tell.
You see it.
So it could be happening anywhere.
You see a similar reshuffling of timelines in Chariots of Fire.
Hmm.
Uh, what was his name? Eric Little. He didn't want to run on the Sabbath. Well, in the movie, they depict him as only finding out that he was scheduled to run on Sunday as he's boarding the ship, when in reality, all that had been hashed out
Right.
earlier before he even departed.
Yep.
But for dramatic effect, they moved it later so that, it would work out better for the film.
Right. And it's we don't call that a lie because it's just a movie, right?
Right.
right.
But
Right.
but in the gospels the question is, was this really the way that the audience would have looked at it? And also, those movies aren't reliable. Okay, so this is the other thing. It's like I like those movies, but if I want a reliable story about the life of Eric Little or of King George the Sixth, that's not where I'm going to go.
Right.
If you were writing a history, uh, you know, dissertation maybe for your PhD in history, you wouldn't say, footnote the King's Speech, for your original source on the events in the life of George the Sixth. That would your dissertation committee would frown on that, to put it mildly.
Yes, yes.
Right. Right.
It's better to use Wikipedia.
You shouldn't go to the chosen to get your understanding of the biblical story.
Right, right, right.
Same
So
problem.
even if something were so-called all right, because the audience is okay with it, that doesn't automatically make it reliable. And
Mhm.
this is why these claims are in fact undermining reliability.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think just to get people started off. Um, the Gospels are the Gospels a Greco-Roman biography, and if so, what difference does that make? Perhaps that is a time to now kind of look at this. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? Where'd it go? This one.
Yeah. So that's the question. Do they fall into that genre? Which is what's being alleged, right?
Right. So the short answer is no. But of course, there's a much, larger answer. One thing that's important to know is that I don't agree with Richard Burridge and with Michael Licona about even what that genre itself was. Okay, so they argue that the very nature of that genre was that it was like a movie based on true events. The minute you recognize it's in that genre, you'd be like, okay, like we would say about a movie, there could just be stuff changed here and I wouldn't be able to tell. I don't agree that that was even what the genre was like. So the thesis fails at multiple levels. First, is the genre even like what they say it was like? I say no. Second of all, are the Gospels, would the Gospel authors have heard of it? For 3 out of 4, with the possible exception of Luke, I would say no, they probably wouldn't have even read Plutarch. And then, third question, if, contrary to what I say is fact, if the genre were like what Lacone and Burge say, and if the authors had heard of it, would they be writing their documents in it? And the answer to that is also no. So it can fail at each one of these levels. After all, we have both documentaries and movies based on true event in our own time. So the mere fact that such a thing exists doesn't mean that any given video is a movie based on true events. There are people who say, yeah, but I want to make a documentary. So, I would say the Gospels are definitely not Greco-Roman bioi in the sense that they believe them to be. And I would say for 3 out of 4 of the authors, they probably hadn't even encountered them. So that makes it even harder.
Now, you said in your book, you write that Richard Burridge claims that ancient people generally had a different view of truth and of the legitimacy of fabrication than we do in modern times. That is something that keeps coming back in biblical academic writing, which I just think is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's this sweeping thing. And the funny thing is, we're being told, don't be anachronistic, don't be anachronistic. You have to understand them as they understood themselves. There is nobody so anachronistic as a certain kind of modern biblical scholar.
Yeah.
And they don't seem to recognize that they're the ones being anachronistic. They're making the gospel authors over in their own image, where it's kind of cool to be loosey-goosey about the truth in the service of a higher truth and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting, there's a passage I quote in a couple of my books from Richard Burridge, who's a classicist and a gospel scholar. He says a student came to him about the Gospel of John and asked him, why is John changing all these facts about Jesus in his gospel when he keeps making all these statements about truth? This is a very good question, of course. And Burridge said, the negative connotation of fabrication is modern. I mean, that's crazy. We can find quote after quote after quote from church fathers, historians, etc., saying, no, literal truth is really important in history. We can also find people who were cynical and just said, do whatever you have to do to get the results you want. I mean, we have people like that today as well. But there's certainly no, ancient versus modern dichotomy where the ancients were, golly, what a surprise, just like semi-postmodern literary professors nowadays. That's a very false view of ancient people.
I mean, they argued, some of them argued over whether the gods even existed.
Sure.
They don't, I mean, they had the same basic spectrum. What I think what makes our time different is which bandwidths in the spectrum are the more pronounced at any given time.
And I wouldn't say that necessarily a loose view of truth was particularly pronounced at the time of the Gospels either. And we also find that Christians particularly have this earnestness about them. You can see it in the early church fathers. You can see it in the introduction to the book of Luke. You can see, those first few verses. You can see it in what the author of John says. He who saw it bore record, and his record is true, and he knows what he says is true. That literal truth to the Christians especially was so important because God had revealed himself in history so that even these little things became important, like that they didn't break Jesus' legs. That's
right.
the people who are advocating this kind of genre theory, they're like, well, it's the big picture that's true. Jesus was crucified or whatever. Well, in that case, whether his legs were broken or not wouldn't be important. But
You know,
John says it is important because that's what fulfilled prophecy, he believes.
exactly. Now, something I had mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned to you, I did mention to Ron some years ago. We had written an article regarding the Jesus Seminar. I love the Jesus Seminar. Terrible heretics, but they were fun to make fun of. And they had this idea that a large that the folks around the Mediterranean and in that time period were illiterate. And that's generally probably true. But that assumes that because many of them were illiterate, the Jewish people were as illiterate. And I would say that's probably not true. I mean, they spent time
Yeah.
reading the scriptures to each other in the synagogue. They were quite literate, actually. And so
You got to wonder why they put a sign over the doorway
exactly.
between the court of the Gentiles and the court of the women in the temple that says if you cross this line, you're going to die if you're a
Right.
Gentile.
Right.
I mean, what about all those illiterate people who can't read it? Well,
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's important to this discussion, I think, because they're trying to put what may have been generally true onto these Jewish people. Isn't that exactly what these scholars are trying to do? Was trying to shoehorn their writings into this Greco-Roman biography.
Well, let me tell you something kind of interesting about how those things intersect, and it may come as a surprise to you. I don't know, but what I find is that there's a tendency to conflate being able to read and speak Greek with using specific Greek literary genres. So we do have evidence, as you both just mentioned, signs written in Greek and so forth, of Greek literacy among even Jews in
yeah.
Jesus' time and place. But then they'll jump straight over from that to, so therefore they would have
Right.
been educated from these exercise books. They would have known the story of Homer's Odyssey. They would have, they would have read Plutarch. And it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. There's a big difference between being able to read and speak Greek and, on the other hand, being trained in this very specific type of school curriculum. Now, I don't agree that even that school curriculum was teaching, hey, you become a historian, it's fine to change the facts. But I also don't think that the gospel authors' literacy in the Greek language translates over to, yes, so then they went to school and they did exercises based on Homer's Odyssey.
Right.
That's
Right.
a much different issue. And so I think it's important to make all those distinctions.
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
Who
Yeah.
was reading Paul's letters if they're all illiterate?
I think they did read things aloud, but someone had to be there to
Right.
to read them aloud.
The estimate, I mean, they're all shots in the dark. I've heard estimates of 10% literacy rate throughout the Roman Empire. I have books. I've collected books just on this question, or books and scholarly articles. And when you look at it, it's like every time they really don't know.
Right. And then to take it even farther and say what kind of specific curriculum they were using, like you've gone way beyond your data at that point.
Right.
Well, and by the way, Ron, A Shot in the Dark is one of my favorite Pink Panther movies. So
okay, I don't remember that
one. Two questions about the Gospels as Greco-Roman
bioi.
Okay.
Well, I don't. That's just the subheading of the chapter. So okay. I didn't pick up what the two questions were. I was kind of putting everything together quickly.
Okay,
yes, and you sent it to me, and I only got it 5 minutes, or no, that's not true. Maybe 15 minutes before we got on, and I haven't reviewed that section, so I'm not sure what the two questions.
I can tell you in a minute.
My own book.
Well, we could make something up as long as we're doing. It doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to be entertaining.
I'm opening my Kindle.
No.
So why don't we go back to the questions that we exchanged via email? Did we cover all of them?
Okay, no. How does this affect the historical reliability of the Gospels, which is what we really want to get at?
Yeah. So, as we were just saying about movies based on true events, it would make them quite unreliable. Now, sometimes people will say, oh, so you're just afraid of they're being unreliable and you're going to therefore throw these theories out because you're a fundamentalist, you can't handle that. um, what I always say is, once we realize what's at stake here and that it would be unreliable, the way movies based on true events are unreliable, that should motivate us to look into the arguments. I find too many people out there who are they just listen to this glib talk and they're like, oh,
Right.
that sounds good. And they go with it and they don't dig in, they don't delve in. And that's where I say stop. Realize that something is really at stake here and look into it. So, yes, it would make the Gospels unreliable. Now, let's find out if that's true. And by that very same token, external and internal evidence that the Gospels are reliable is evidence against this genre theory.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If we found that there was some movie and, we were missing the first, I don't know, 5 minutes of it, so we didn't know whether there was a disclaimer that said it was based on true events. And then we're trying to find out, is this a documentary or is it a drama or whatever? And we check again and again and again, and they're getting all kinds of things right. And they're saying, no, everything in this is true. It's like presenting itself as being true. Then that would influence and should influence our idea of what kind of a genre it is.
Well, and even that sometimes that statement can be used as satire, which it is in Fargo, which we know is not an actual account of true
Oh,
events.
yeah. Every Fargo episode you were telling me begins with,
Yeah, it begins with, this all happened. This is a factual happening. Blah blah blah, and so it makes this claim that it's all true, when in fact it's just part of the satire of the whole series.
It's important to realize that we live in an information age where we can find that out, right?
Mhm.
Right.
We can go look stuff up and check. But we know that the Gospels were being read aloud in the churches from a very early time, the church meetings. Justin Martyr calls them the memoirs of the
I
apostles and
like
their
that.
companions.
Yeah.
So we know that the early church was taking them to be
Mhm.
factual in a literal sense.
Yeah.
This is why in my book on John, the Eye of the Beholder is the name of that book, I say that we have a Johannine dilemma. Either the Gospel of John is a historical document, not changing anything, that the author's always trying to get it right, or it's a hoax. Okay, it's
Right.
not in some genre that he just knew that his audience would recognize as satire or partial fiction or whatever. And a hoax is a far more serious thing, because then you really are trying to put one over on the people. And
Right.
so either John is really serious about truth or he's trying to put one over on people. And what the genre theorists are trying to do is give us a third option, and I argue that that third option is not there.
Yeah. Now, this is not directly related to it, but I think it helps those who are viewing to understand something, because we've gone to the Gospel of John several times, and even though it is historical in the sense of he's selling here's the life of Jesus, he had a particular um,
Emphasis.
argument he was making, and that is both the pre-existence of the Lord and the physicality of the Lord. The Ebionites denied his pre-existence, and we see that covered in the first 3 verses of his gospel. In the beginning, he points back to Genesis, was the Word was with God, the Word was God. So he's arguing that the Word always existed. And then to the um, what's the other group?
Docetists?
Docetist, he says, and the Word became flesh.
Yeah.
First, and then almost everything that's in there in the history
Right.
points to those two
And,
topics.
Jesus says the Father sent the Son into the world. Okay, that kind of implies pre-existence.
It does, absolutely.
Yeah. The
So, so the credibility of everything in the work then is important, because he's arguing for a particular view of who Christ is.
and you have 2 Gospels that have actual texts that are designed to certify that these things are true. The Gospel of John ends with, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And then the Gospel of Luke begins with, that he's saying, I've put together this orderly account. I've researched it among eyewitnesses, ministers of the word, and so on, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So, it's like they don't seem to have a different definition of truth than we do today.
Not at all.
That's true, but people do like to pick and choose, and so we have a
Well,
sponsor that kind of
well, we don't want to leave those people out, do we? Yeah, I mean, so the question our sponsor has is, are you tired of hearing all about the difference between the milk of the word and the meat of the word? Are you wondering when your church is going to get around to serving the ice cream and cheesecake of the word? Does your pastor take that whole Bible thing way too seriously? Well, then you need to check out the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience. Everything at the Bible Buffet is prepared with your comfort and enjoyment in view. Everything there is gluten free, trans fat free, and truth claim free. And all of their dishes are piping hot and ready to eat. And they're always open, even during COVID, thanks to Bible Buffet carryout. Their regular Sunday specials include Aryan appetizers, Sibelian succotash, Galatian goulash, Gnostic nut salad, Pelagian pie, and Socinian salad. And don't forget, the Bible Buffet is a fully accredited ministry of the Church of Smorgasbordianism. The Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience, but it should be yours.
it should be
So
yours.
we're back, and Lydia will be back as soon as she can. Um, so, uh, where are we? Do we cover all of the questions on that email, or
No, we do have two more. Do those affirm Greco-Roman biography redefine what we mean by historical reliability? And the other one is, would this approach fundamentally undermine the historical validity of Christianity? Now, while we await her soon return, you have been reading through her books. What is the thing that has most grabbed your attention about what she's doing?
well, just how? I mean, she's not really saying anything so far that I've encountered that hasn't already been said by standard apologists, in this field, and she's doing it from a different point of view. I mean, in terms of, or I should say, a different academic background, and she's finding the same things. So I don't have one of the books open, but let me find. There it is, The Mirror and the Mask. This is the one that we're actually going through. Um, it's kind of disturbing to me, and she's coming back here, and
That's not disturb. That's not the disturbing part, though,
no,
right?
that's not the disturbing part. That's that Lydia's back. That's not disturbing. The disturbing part to me is that we have, okay, let's continue to name names. Do I understand correctly that Daniel B. Wallace endorses Michael Lacona's project here?
It seems that he does, and not only that, but two of the most, I would say, striking examples of these fact-changing literary devices. I often use them as examples to show that these aren't just itty-bitty little things that Dr. Lacona endorses. He actually got from Daniel B. Wallace, and he cites him. It's an unpublished paper, and it's remained unpublished for 24 years. It never was published. And so Dr. Lacona sort of let the cat out of the bag. I would never have known that this was Dr. Wallace's position, but he's like,
What what
writing it.
specific what specific, I mean, it's his whole position or just a specific part of his position?
So I'll give you these two examples. It's a paper on Jesus' words from the cross that he delivered in the year 2000 on Jesus' last words from the cross. And in that paper, Wallace argues, and then Lacona borrows this from him, that Jesus never said in a recognizable way, I am thirsty, I thirst, and that he never said, it is finished. Okay, that these are things that John invented. He was sort of, what shall we say,
Creative.
inspired by different historical sayings. So Jesus really did historically say, my God, why have you forsaken me? John knew about that, and then he said, I'm going to make that into him saying, I thirst. And like you have no way of telling. You read John, they actually bring Jesus sour wine, so he's clearly portraying this as his literally saying, "I thirst." But that this was John's what did he call it? A transformation, a dynamic equivalent transformation. Wallace calls it.
What is gained? What
My
is
God,
gained?
I know it's crazy. It's
What
crazy.
is what problem is avoided by positing this as a fabrication?
I
I
know
don't
it's
understand.
crazy. So I've read now Wallace's argument, if you can even call it that, and it's that John sees the cross as Jesus' glorification. He sees his cross as a time of glory and triumph, and it doesn't fit with his theme for Jesus to be literally thirsty and expressing literal thirst. And I mean, your head just begins to split at this point, because if that didn't fit with John's theme, all he had to do was leave it out, right?
Right.
Instead of inventing something, but then going, but in my private heart of hearts, I feel that this is really
So,
okay because I know he didn't really say it. Ha ha ha.
so
It's a metaphor, even though you
right.
can't tell by reading my gospel. It's crazy. And the second one, "It is finished," is supposed to be invented based upon "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." So what Jesus really said was, historically, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," and John transforms this into "It is finished," which is like a more, I don't know, triumphant cry or whatever. So that's striking. And so when people say, "Oh, these are nothing," and I'm like, really? So if you get up to preach, you're a pastor, you get up to preach and you preach on Jesus saying, "I thirst," from the cross, and how this illustrates his suffering and his union with us in our humanity, and et cetera, et cetera. And then it's like Dan Wallace and Mike Lacona are here to tell you it didn't really happen.
See,
Wow.
now this kind of really changes my understanding of what went down. Now, Lacona was a teacher at Dallas at one time, right?
I don't think Lacona ever taught at you mean Dallas Seminary?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
But
Did his PhD
Wallace,
there? I mean, Lacona had a connection to Dallas somehow.
well, he's good friends with
Okay.
people there,
So,
Bach
so
and Wallace and those guys.
my understanding was is that this goes back. I was reading a long time ago when this thing kind of exploded. Was that Wallace, wanted to help Lacone out, so he sat down with him to hear his point of view. And once, once he heard it, then he could vouch for it, that it was a true inerrancy position. And I thought I heard Wallace say that he didn't really totally agree with it, but it fell within the bounds of what you would call inerrancy. And now this totally changes
Right.
what my perception was.
Right. Well, I definitely wouldn't take Wallace's word for it as far as whether someone's an inerrantist or not, because he thinks that, he considers himself to be, but he thinks that John invented "I thirst." So what is that? Oh, it's like a bad pun. It's not an error. He did it on purpose.
Oh yeah, and it's inspired, he can claim.
Right. Right. But it's like, no, I'm not an inerrantist, but if inerrancy has any point to it at all, it's surely that in these putatively historical books, the historical things that are narrated are historically true. I mean,
Not
it's like,
historically
if you
true.
lose that, what's the point of being an inerrantist at all?
Right.
And you kind of lean to the side of the historical things that are reported actually happened, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, so I'm not an inerrantist because there are places where I think that, especially in the Gospels, so let's just stick to the Gospels for a moment, places where I think that someone made what I call a good faith error. He's trying to get it right. And I have a video called "Errancy and the Courtroom Witness." I think that's the title of the YouTube video, where I argue that good faith error in a person who is well informed, he's close to the facts, is much less undermining of reliability than deliberate change. And so the example that I give is you have a witness in court and he's asked what day a certain thing happened, and he says Saturday. And then he comes under cross examination and he's forced to admit that it was really Wednesday. And he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You're right. I see now the events of Saturday and Wednesday were somewhat similar and I got confused. So it's a good faith error."
Yeah.
Now imagine that same witness says Saturday. He comes under cross examination. shows it was Wednesday, and the witness says, "Yeah, I knew it was Wednesday all along. I changed it because I thought it made a better story." You're on the jury.
That would be
Which of these is going to make you doubt the reliability of that witness more?
right.
Obviously, the second one.
And it's one thing to I mean, okay, so some of the historical accounts of the Gospels do present difficulties. We can't deny that. We can't, especially the resurrection accounts. There are different ways that have been, different methods have been used to harmonize them. But yeah, I mean, to say I deliberately changed it, or that is, yeah, that is right away. You're going to the just the ethical reliability of the writer, not just his reliability concerning facts, but that's part of it.
And you don't know. So we have a pretty good idea of what kinds of things witnesses who are trying to get it right, who are close to the facts, accidentally get wrong. And that allows us to what we might call calibrate for
Mhm.
that. But once we're going off into the subjective realm of what he thinks makes a better story, now we have no way of calibrating for that. How do
Right.
you know he's gonna think is gonna make a better story? And in fact, that I thirst example was a very good example. Why in the world would we think that John would consider it better to invent I thirst?
How does that help his credibility on anything that he reports?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so that kind of brings us to question number 4. Do those who affirm Greco-Roman biography redefine what they mean historical reliability?
Yeah, they absolutely do. And so they'll use these words, which and it's a shame because a word like gist, it has a legitimate use. But now it's like that word has been co-opted. I don't even feel like I can use it anymore. So they'll take words like gist. Well, we get the gist, but it's such a high level gist that at this point, any movie based on true events is also would also be considered reliable by that definition. And something that my good friend Tom Gilson has really pointed out is the way this would impact pastoral ministry.
Yeah.
Because when a pastor is going to counsel people or he's going to preach, so here's a very practical example. Did Jesus or did he not utter the exception clause for divorce? Okay, that no divorce except for porneia, fornication. Okay, now one thing that these guys say is, Lacona says this, a guy named Stein has said this. I mean, it's a pretty widespread view that Matthew inserted that Jesus didn't really say that exception, but Matthew thought that Jesus would have endorsed that Jesus would have agreed, but he put it into Jesus' mouth when Jesus didn't actually say it. Well, suppose you're a pastor, you're counseling someone whose
Right.
whose wife has left him for another man, and you want to tell this guy it's okay. Jesus exception clause, covers this, and you're free. That was not your fault. And then you read the scholar who says, no, Matthew put that into Jesus' mouth. And you're like, uh-oh, now what? Did I just counsel this person based on something that Jesus didn't really teach? So it's got a tremendous amount of importance. And merely saying it's reliable, asterisk, I'm going to put a little asterisk next to it, about only the largest level, just big picture events, that doesn't give us what we actually normally consider that we're getting from the Gospels as far as our doctrine, our practice, and our knowledge of the life and teachings of Jesus.
So the really weird thing is I'm sitting here, with my, biblical theology and higher criticism background. What happened to our? Okay, there we go.
I pushed the wrong signal.
We're playing with the buttons again. Yes.
I'm going to be back momentarily. You two carry on smartly.
Oh, okay. If anybody who knows the history of higher criticism, it makes no sense for Matthew to have inserted the exception clause, because Matthew is considered by the higher critics to be the more rigorous in terms of that. A lot of them believe that Matthew was responding to Paul, and that he was get people back to the law, get Christians back to the law, and he would have definitely sided with a more rigorous approach. And so you would have to say if it was inserted by somebody other than Matthew somebody who later came along. And then the question comes up, well, why wasn't it inserted in the other gospels, which are supposedly less rigorous? So all of the evidence seems to point to Matthew actually put it in there. I mean, from
Because
when
it
you
happened.
right, you look at it from different angles, from all the different critical angles that have been examined, and you're still left with the conclusion. The only satisfying explanation, in my view, is it was part of the original text.
I think too that even though the apostles were endorsed by Jesus to lead, the early church, they never regarded themselves as licensed to put words into his mouth. And we see this really clearly in John. John will record something that Jesus said, and then he'll like pause and he'll give you his gloss on it. So, for example, when Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," and then the narrator says he said this concerning the temple of his body. He doesn't pretend that Jesus said, "I'm talking about the temple of my body." So even though he was like, "Yeah, I'm an apostle, I have the Holy Spirit, I'm a leader, etc." That's fine, but he still distinguishes between his interpretation and what Jesus, the historical Jesus, said. We find John doing that over and over again. And we find Papias emphasizing trying to get back as close as possible to what Jesus himself taught rather than what other men taught. So sometimes I'll find these literary device theorists, they're sort of exploiting our respect for the apostles. Like, well, you respect the apostles, don't you? Don't you think that the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles? Well, yeah, but I wouldn't respect them if they were pretending that Jesus literally said things in his historical voice, then it was really their ideas. Then I would lose respect for them,
Right.
right? So
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
important to do that.
they handled the distinction between the events and their interpretations very carefully.
Very.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, Don,
Yeah.
while you were gone, I pulled up the questions, but then you arrived back just in time.
Okay. So, would this approach fundamentally undermine the historical validity of Christianity?
I would argue that it would. And, one of you mentioned the resurrection accounts a couple minutes
Yeah.
ago. I
I
think
did.
that
Yeah.
was Don. Um, I actually find the resurrection accounts to be some of the most harmonizable. Like there are other places, like what day Jesus' feet were anointed in the week
Hmm.
before his death, that I find more recalcitrant. I'll put it that way. But with very few exceptions, I find the
That's
resurrection
interesting.
narratives very harmonizable. But when we go to this and we say, okay, if the resurrection narratives are all filled with embellishments, which is what the higher critics believe, and Dr. Lacona just basically goes to many of those places and slaps a sticky note on it labeled literary device.
Right.
It's like
Right.
Yeah.
literally one of his followers is a young man named Tim Stratton, and Tim Stratton characterizes Lacona's view as these contradictions just melt away. No, they
Yeah.
don't. We're just relabeling them.
Right.
Relabeling them doesn't make them melt away. So if they're full of these embellishments, um, that's a real problem for our argument for even the physical resurrection of Jesus, because those physical aspects of the resurrection accounts, like where he eats, where he asks them, he says they can touch him and so forth. Those are the very ones that the higher critics are most pointing at and saying, nah, those were made up later. Those are apologetic additions. So that's just one example of how it would, and there are other ways in which it would fundamentally undermine Christianity.
Well, there,
Because,
you know, there,
yeah.
there, are- there are two things in here that really are very close to my heart. One is it's reminiscent sort of Murray J. Harris, who essentially denied the physicality of the resurrection. He said Jesus was raised bodily, but not a physical body. And he went through the gospel accounts and found things that he found, difficult on, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and they didn't recognize him. Uh, well, and I we pointed out, we said, look, okay, it tells us why they didn't recognize him. It just isn't something that they just popped into the text. It says their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him. The answer to the dilemma you think you have is in the text.
Right.
The
Right.
And this,
second is
yeah,
Bart Ehrman. We had Bart Ehrman at one of our conferences, and he debated Craig Evans. Craig Evans, good guy, not a great debater with a street fighter like Bart Ehrman.
I'll have a comment about Craig Evans after you're done, but go ahead.
Yeah, just that my thing is he was trying to be so gentlemanly. It struck me as that Bart Ehrman got away with a lot of things, and one of the things he said was, if you start from the beginning of a gospel read to the end, which is what everybody does, you won't realize all of the inconsistencies. But if you read across each of them at the same time, you'll see them. And so I said, okay, let's do that. And so I sat down and wrote an article. It was published, Southern or Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, their journal published it. And then I did a second part, which we published. And then we just went gospel to gospel to gospel, looked at each account, and the answers are in the account. If you look at them together, there isn't an inconsistency. You
Right.
just
They're
have to
harmonized.
follow the P.
I'm very much a fan of harmonization, and it's a funny thing because this is where I get accused of being a fundamentalist. So I kind of get it from both sides, right? Oh, she must be an inerrantist because she's harmonizing all over the place. And I say I'm not harmonizing because I'm an inerrantist. I'm not an inerrantist. I'm harmonizing because I'm trying to do good history, and in
Right.
good history, it's usually good to harmonize. It's important to harmonize.
well, you're
Um,
assuming
yeah.
that the writers had some integrity, and you're trying to think, you're trying to be as sympathetic as possible to the way they're presenting their material, without assuming that they were manipulating the facts.
And also, even if you go into something and you don't necessarily know, like you're a policeman and you're interviewing people, right? For all, you've never met this person before in your life, still that the normal way that witness testimony goes is that you'll have these slight variations, but very often they will be harmonizable.
Right.
So, an example that J. Warner Wallace gives is of a, a robbery where one witness, apparently this was a real example that happened in his work as a policeman. One witness said that the robber ran away on foot, and the other witness said that he jumped into a truck, I think it was. And they were just standing at different points looking out the window, and he ran across the parking lot. That's what the one guy saw. And then he jumped into his truck. That's what the other guy saw. And so when you know testimony, you recognize testimony. And you read the Gospels, and they have what I call the texture of testimony. And that reconcilability of these variations is part of that texture. Now, I want to
You know,
say something real quick about Craig Evans. If you read my book, The Eye of the Beholder, you'll find that I quote Evans a lot. In a 2012 pair of debates, they were it was kind of the same debate done twice back to back with Bart Ehrman. Evans threw the Gospel of John absolutely under the bus. It was shocking. Um, there are nuggets, he says, nuggets of history in John, but it's really in a different genre from the other Gospels. He's also argued that even the synoptics authors considered themselves licensed to change things. He uses a different word from Lacona. He uses the word crea rather than bioi. But basically, what we're doing in both of these cases is we're just accepting that they're changing facts, they're making stuff up, and we're slapping a label on it. He even said that Jesus in John sometimes looks like the allegorical figure of Lady Wisdom in the Old Testament, to where we shouldn't take those to be historical because he looks like an allegorical figure. And so, like the Bread of Life discourse is an example. Well, in the Bread of Life discourse, it says he's speaking in the synagogue at Capernaum. You read your wisdom literature, you never find Lady Wisdom was speaking at the synagogue at Capernaum. It's very clearly being presented not as an allegory, but as an actual historical occasion. So this was very shocking to a lot of people, and they had trouble accepting that Evans was really doing this because they thought of him as a defender of the reliability of the Gospels, but it turns out he's really on board with this fact-changing stuff. So I wanted to
well,
make that note.
there's something that happens, and Ron and I have talked about this before, and he even told me where this came from. But there's something that happens in scholars, it seems to me, that fall in love with an idea that may endear them to another group of more liberal, let's say. And so they kind of do this thing where they go, "I'll call you Christian if you'll call me smart," and they begin compromising.
That's George Marston.
Uh,
I'll call you a Christian if you call me a scholar.
yeah.
There's, and I don't even think they always realize they're doing it, but there's a very good example of this in Dale Allison. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Dale Allison.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Lacona did a series of interviews with him in 2021. And in that series of interviews, he said, Dale, you're a fellow believer. Tell us about your prayer practices. Dale Allison is not a fellow believer. He thinks it's funny what you said about Murray. That's Allison's position, that Jesus' body disappeared, probably, he's not even certain of it, probably disappeared from the tomb, kind of like some Buddhist gurus' bodies disappear from their tomb. He makes that comparison explicitly. But then he did not appear bodily to his disciples. He appeared to them only in visions. And I'm sorry, but it's an essential part of Christian belief that Jesus was bodily resurrected, and Allison even sort of sneers at it. He's like, I don't see any advantage theologically in Jesus who is so literally physical that he has genitals and kidneys.
Well, how about this? If he didn't rise from the dead, he lied about who he is and what he can do, because he said in John 2, destroy this body. And in 3 days, I will raise it up again.
He spoke with the temple of his body.
Yeah, he spoke with the temple of his body. And after the resurrection, the disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed his word and the scriptures. That would be the Old Testament.
Right.
Has anybody tried to explain how, or noted the fact that Luke tells us at the end of Luke 4, or toward the end of, it's more in the middle, I guess, when they tried to throw him off the cliff, it says, but passing through their midst, he went away. They didn't see him. I mean, they were trying to kill him.
Jesus did weird, I think what you're pointing out here is Jesus did weird things even before he died.
Right.
And he did weird, miraculous things after he rose again. So that doesn't mean that he was non-physical before he died.
Right,
so it also doesn't mean he was non-physical after he rose again. People will do that with, he could walk through doors. He could walk through walls. That must have meant he didn't have a solid body. It's like, well, the example you've just given, does that mean he didn't have a solid body then? No, it doesn't mean that.
Well, okay. And because that is like one of my total favorites. Where does it say he walked through a door or walked through a wall? It doesn't say that. Now, we have a similar happening with not Jesus, but with Peter, who was in a prison, in the inner prison, chained to 2 guards. An angel comes in. The guards didn't see him. The light goes on. The guards didn't see him. The chains fall off. The guards didn't see him. Peter gets up and gets dressed. The guards didn't see him. He walks out. The door opens. He walks out the opening. The door closes. He walks out to the next door. It opens. He goes out and heads home. The next morning, they come to get Peter, and he's not there, and no one knows where he is.
Yeah. It's a miracle.
All in his entirely physical body.
Yeah. These things are miracles. Jesus could walk on water, so he had an unusual relationship at that moment to the water. That doesn't call into question the physicality of his body. I mean, you're absolutely right. And I point this out. One thing I often point out, too, is we never find a case where on earth, now before the ascension, I'm not talking about Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, but before the ascension, where one person says, wow, I'm having this great conversation with Jesus, and another person says, what are you talking about? There's nobody there. So they say, they failed to recognize him. Sometimes, as you say, Luke treats that as unusual. The default is that they recognize him, but they know that there's a guy there talking to them.
Yeah.
He's never invisible.
In Luke chapter 4, Luke goes out of his way to report that the people knew Jesus since he was a kid. Now, in John chapter 8, at the end of that, it simply says they're trying to stone him. They picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. How do you do those two things at the same time? Hiding yourself and going out of the temple.
I think of it as like a Jedi mind trick, These aren't the
It could be. It could very well be, but it was
you can go on your way.
I think it probably was something like that. It's just that it explains that you don't, just because they don't see him doesn't mean he's not physical.
Seeable.
He's
Yeah.
powerful.
Well,
And like I say, they always seem to have been able to see him. I would go so far as to say that if an unbeliever had happened to walk by on the Sea of Galilee while they're there having breakfast, he would have seen Jesus there. You
Mhm.
didn't need special eyes of faith or something. You could have knocked on his head. He was literally there.
I had back to Harris because this is so similar to the whole Harris thing. He was examined by some scholars on his view, and of course they were friendly scholars, not friendly spirits, but friendly scholars. And they decided that yes, he is Orthodox, even though because today he sounds Orthodox to us. And so I wrote to one of them and I said, okay, Harris says that in his normal state he is invisible and immaterial. Why? Because the disciples weren't continuously seeing him.
Mm.
I have to
It's a
point
mystery.
out that as you're reading my letter, you are not seeing me. You have never, in fact, seen me in the past, and you may never see me in the future. Does that mean that in my normal state I am invisible and non corporeal? And he wrote back and said, talk to Harris. I mean, that's a stupid
No, they're
position.
just defending him. And what you find with that kind of thing is it's kind of what my friend Tom Gilson calls a Fragen blitzer, a question blitz. That if you can't answer every possible question, where did Jesus go? Did he sleep at night? After he was resurrected, did he sleep at night when he
Did
wasn't
he
with
eat at McDonald's?
right when he wasn't with the disciples? Was
You
he
could get fries at McDonald's.
somewhere else, etc. And we don't have to know all of the answers. So the implication is if you don't know the answers to all these questions, then you don't know what you're talking about
Right.
when you say he was bodily resurrected. And of course, that doesn't follow at all. You can know what you're talking about, even though you don't have answers, to all of these questions. So it's interesting to me that as we're undermining gospel reliability, we're then undermining the physicality of Jesus' resurrection, then we're redefining orthodoxy so that you don't really have to affirm the physicality of Jesus' resurrection appearances in order to be an Orthodox Christian. Now,
Right.
once again, I want to say I'm an evidentialist. If they had good arguments, then the best thing to do would just be to say, golly, I guess Orthodox Christianity is wrong. Um, I I've examined the arguments. The arguments are terrible. So this is a plea for recognizing this is important, whether the arguments are good or bad. And I think when you look into it, you'll find that the arguments that the gospel authors did this are not good arguments.
All right. Now, we want to honor our time with you. We want to be careful to not overtax you. How about that? Unlike the government, we don't want to overtax you. So, but we do. Ron and I kind of were whispering back and forth. We do want to have you back again in the future if you're willing to do that.
Yeah, sure.
All right, and
Sounds
that would
fun.
be great fun. Ron, would you waltz us out of here,
Let's
baby?
give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profile is Kneel Before Me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and Dia Poser. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Joe Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never, never, never.
So far, it hasn't happened.
Exactly. Lydia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And
Y'all come
we
back
will
now.
do something in the future. Everyone else, adios.
Thank you. It's